Well, I think it's prevalent in Aboriginal communities, for Indigenous communities, but it's also prevalent in any sort of marginalized group, oppressed group. Yeah. So you know, when I was, I've had different times in my life where I've been in conditions of privilege, but I've also been in conditions of poverty. And same thing. Poverty also can breed lateral violence, because it's a frustrating, it's a difficult way to live. You know, living hand to mouth, it's tough. And you know, and so the consequences emotionally for people are you know, to lash out wherever it's safe to do that. And then, you know, and then children are socialized in that context. Why is it prevalent in Indigenous communities? Because we were trained that way in residential schools. Residential schools were total institutions, and a total institution is it's like concentration camps, right? So the kids were brought in, their identities were stripped, literally. Their heads were shaved, they were stripped, they were deloused, they were given, you know, raggy uniforms. Some were tattooed, and then they went through a regimented schedule that include things like starvation and repetitive things like praying. Some kids recall praying 15 times a day. You know, they'd be on their knees at different intervals. Sleep deprivation, right? So total institutions, they're brainwashing institutions. And the interesting thing about those total institutions was, in many, many instances, our ancestors were fed a certain line, and the line was, you know, you're savages, and we're civilizing you, and we're educating you. But in reality, what was happening, the reality was so much different than that. The reality was physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse. And the psychological abuse really is it's the subtle one, and it's the one that's so difficult when we talk about lateral violence, because it can be subtle, right? You know, I see lateral violence being perpetrated on such subtle levels, and it's in attitudes, it's in how people look at each other. We communicate all the time with so much more than our words, which is why, you know, to me, I'm so interested in body language, and because you see it, we see all that information. It comes in all the time. We're all constantly communicating with each other, but it's so subtle, right? And so in the schools, the kids were taught these subtleties. They were taught to not talk to each other. Siblings were separated, so they were forced not to talk to each other. And children were rewarded for backstabbing, right, for tattling on each other, and they were deliberately pitted against each other. So all of the strategies of lateral violence were encouraged and perpetrated and taught in the schools, and some schools were much more notorious. I remember interviewing some survivors, and I remember one of the participants said that at the Onion Lake schools, they didn't experience a lot of physical or sexual abuse, and they were really grateful for that. But they said what was even worse maybe was the psychological abuse, because they were very deliberately trained how to be laterally violent with each other, and it was supported and perpetrated and nurtured by the people in the positions of power. Ironically, you know, church people, religious people, right? And so that just the residential schools were just sort of this massive cognitive dissonance dynamic. Because on the one hand, I mean, you think about it, right? It was the church. What is the church supposed to represent in Western cultures? It's supposed to be something good, something divine, holy, sacred, and all of that. And yet the schools were these abysses of depredation and degradation. Yeah. So that's why, because we have 5 generations, you know, of our people who have gone through these institutions where all of these horrible things were perpetrated.